Multimedia Publishing Incorporated, Denver, Colorado, presents the Get Acquainted series, introducing authors and places in American literature. This unit, written by Paul Friesen, introduces James Fenimore Cooper. In this unit, you will learn who Cooper was, where and when he lived, how his life as a youth in the frontier country of central New York State influenced his most popular writings, and how he dealt sympathetically with the vanishing traditions and primitive life of wilderness areas in America. The village of Cooperstown was founded by William Cooper, who migrated to this central New York wooded wilderness in 1790 from New Jersey. It was a primitive land, covered with forests and lakes, and inhabited by numerous tribes of Indians. Cooperstown was located on the southern shore of beautiful Lake Otsego, and it was in this exciting and spectacular setting that America's first novelist, James Fenimore Cooper, grew up and was inspired to write intriguing stories of white settlers and Indians. Cooper was only a year old when his parents moved to Cooperstown. His father had purchased large tracts of land near Lake Otsego, where he established his own home, Otsego Hall, and sold portions of his land to settlers. In all, he settled over 40,000 people before his death in 1809. At the age of 30, James Cooper inherited the mansion and 500,000 acres of land. Cooper grew up in ease and luxury in Otsego Hall. Dr. Warren Walker writes, he wanted for nothing by way of physical comforts, and his mother, Elizabeth Cooper, who detested the frontier, saw to it that the children were introduced to as many cultural refinements as she could have brought overland from Albany, Philadelphia, and New York City. A statue of Cooper now overlooks the site of Otsego Hall, which burned to the ground in 1853, 2 years after Cooper's death. The statue is a tribute to an author who saw in young America the resources for great literature. Dr. Walker writes that Cooper was the first to prove that America already held its own resources of romance, tragedy, heroism, humor, and suspense. Cooper began his writing career in a rather unpromising way. Following a stint as a sailor on a merchant ship and in the U.S. Navy, he married Susan Delancey and settled down to the life of a gentleman farmer. As he was reading an English novel to her one evening, he suddenly tossed it aside and declared that he could write a better one. Susan challenged him to try it. Cooper's reply to the challenge was the sentimental novel Precaution, not a success, but proof to him that he could write. In the next 30 years, from 1820 to 1850, he published 32 novels, plus more than a dozen works of history, travel, and biography. In addition to the novels and other works, Cooper wrote numerous letters and recorded personal events in journals collected in these 6 volumes. His second novel, The Spy, launched Cooper into fame as a novelist in America and in Europe. Set in the Revolutionary War, it tells the exciting story of Harvey Birch, a double agent spying for the Americans. But the British and many Americans believed he was spying for the British. Suspense, adventure, and intrigue abound, story qualities which became Cooper's mainstay in his future novels. It was with his next novel, The Pioneers, that Cooper began a series called The Leatherstocking Tales, which included The Pioneers, The Deer Slayer, The Prairie, The Pathfinder, and The Last of the Mohicans. America was still a young nation without a great depth of historical and legendary past, but Cooper drew on his familiarity with the surrounding wilderness to produce a series of stories involving Indian and white heroes and villains. In The Pioneers, Cooper tells of the settling of Cooperstown on the shores of Lake Otsego. In the novel, the village is called Templeton. The founder is Judge Marmaduke Temple, and the lake is named Glimmerglass. The Pioneers is Cooper's reminiscence of his own life as a youth in Cooperstown, where his father was the judge. In this first novel, Cooper created his most memorable character, Natty Bumpo. Seeking to depict the vanishing wilderness, Cooper set Natty, a white man in his 70s, against the encroaching laws and restrictions of the white settlers. Natty Bumpo, born of white parents, reared by Moravian missionaries among the Delaware Indians, is an illiterate, simple, carefree explorer, scout, and hunter. He achieves legendary fame as a marksman with his long rifle. He lives in the forest and appears at strategic times and places to rescue whites and good Indians. His closest companions are two Delaware Indians, Chingachgook and Uncas. In The Pioneers, Natty lives on the shores of Lake Glimmerglass near Templeton, but he maintains his distance from the settlement. One day he is arrested for killing a buck out of season. Although he has recently rescued the judge's daughter from certain death by shooting an attacking panther, the judge firmly upholds the new laws. Natty must serve time in prison. Natty soon escapes to the security of the woods, where he again rescues the judge's daughter, this time from a forest fire. Although he is now welcome to stay in the forests near Templeton to hunt and fish, he chooses to head west, where the wilderness remains untouched by pioneering settlements. With the publication of The Pioneers, Cooper firmly established himself as a noted professional writer, capitalizing on American themes and events. He was convinced that his stories of Natty and the Indians would endure. He said, "If anything from the pen of the writer of these romances is at all to outlive himself, it is unquestionably the series of the Leatherstocking Tales." Cooper continued the Leatherstocking Tales with The Last of the Mohicans. This novel, published in 1826, marks the pinnacle of Cooper's success as a novelist. Robert Spiller has stated that The Last of the Mohicans was the most popular of all Cooper's novels in his own day, and it is perhaps the most famous Indian story of all time. Cooper used the historical setting of the capture of Fort William Henry by the French general Montcalm during the battle between the French and the English for the possession of upstate New York as the background for The Last of the Mohicans. Cooper employed familiar settings for the novel. The story begins with Major Duncan Hayward's escorting Colonel Monroe's daughters from Fort Edward to Fort William Henry. They are betrayed by their Indian guide, Magua, but are rescued by Natty Bumpo, now called Hawkeye, who hides them in a cave at Glens Falls on the Hudson River. At the falls, a furious hand-to-hand battle takes place. The precarious battleground increases the suspense, and Cooper's vivid description in the novel details the gory scene of violence and death at Glens Falls and several subsequent battle scenes. The scenes along the Hudson River are only the beginning of a series of adventures and of escapes, pursuits, and captures on the water and in the woods. Cooper used Fort William Henry as the focal point of the novel. The weary party finally reach the fort, and the girls, Cora and Alice, embrace their anxious father, Colonel Monroe. But their safety is short-lived, as the fort is eventually captured by Montcalm with his army and his Indian allies. The fort is almost defenseless. The guns are rusty and broken. The walls are crumbling, and provisions are almost gone. Monroe's army and their dependents, a total of about 3,000 men, women, and children, are trapped. Colonel Monroe and his army resist Montcalm's attacks for 3 days while hoping and waiting for reinforcements. But help never comes, and Monroe is forced to surrender. Cooper graphically describes the feeble resistance and the mounting fear of the inhabitants of the fort facing the formidable army of Montcalm with his 3,000 Iroquois Indians eager to take English scalps. Terms of surrender are spelled out. In unprecedented generosity, Montcalm offers freedom and safe escort for the entire English army and their dependents from Fort William Henry south to Fort Edward. Colonel Monroe and his troops and their families silently march out of the fort, leaving it deserted. It is a bitter defeat, but the promise of safe escort to Fort Edward assures their hopes of survival. Cooper, however, uses this incident to portray one of the most dreaded outbursts of Indian rage. Led by the traitorous guide Magua, the Iroquois Indians, furious at the generous terms of surrender, attack the English. They massacre and scalp about 1,000 of their victims. During this attack, Magua captures Cora and Alice and flees with them into the woods. Following this tragic scene, which Montcalm is powerless to stop, he and his army set fire to the fort and depart. While the logs and artillery are still smoldering, Hawkeye, Uncas, Chingachgook, Monroe, and Hayward return to the ruined fort to plan their pursuit of Magua, hoping to rescue Monroe's daughters. The next morning, they stealthily launch a canoe and begin the journey up Lake George to Magua's village, where he would be taking his captives. They watch cautiously to prevent another attack, suspicious that Magua's allies would anticipate their pursuit. Their caution is justified as they soon discover a canoe of Indians pursuing them. At just the right moment, and none too soon, Hawkeye raises his long rifle and fires. Following this brief battle, Hawkeye and the others continue their pursuit, eventually find and kill Magua and rescue Alice. But Uncas, the last of the Mohicans, and Cora are killed in the final scene. In the remaining leather-stocking tales, Cooper details the continuing advances of civilization and Hawkeye's retreat to the west, where in the third novel, The Prairie, Hawkeye, now known simply as the Old Trapper, dies among the Pawnee Indians in the Great Plains of Midwestern America. Cooper waited 13 years after the third novel, The Prairie, to return to the saga of Natty Bumpo. In The Pathfinder, Natty, in his late 30s, lives among the Indians around Lake Ontario, where Natty, named Pathfinder, aids peaceful Indians in their battle with hostile Indians. Romantic love is also present, as it is in most of Cooper's stories. Finally, Cooper wrote of Natty's initiation into the forest and his first battles with enemy tribes. In The Deerslayer, Natty, a young man in his early 20s, kills his first Indian. It is a traumatic experience, and in innocent sympathy, he eases the dying Indian's thirst by giving him a drink from the lake. The Deerslayer completed the Leatherstocking series. Cooper wrote 11 novels of the sea. The first, and still the most popular, was The Pilot, in which Long Tom Coffin, a common, uneducated, boisterous sailor, performs the heroics. In the sea novels, Cooper accurately portrayed life at sea in the early 19th century. Following the publication of The Last of the Mohicans in 1826, Cooper sailed for Europe, where he resided in Paris and London for 7 years. He returned in 1833 to live in Otsego Hall until his death in 1851. While in Europe, he wrote Notions of the Americans and Letter to General Lafayette, both of which offended Americans back home and decreased his popularity. After his return to America, he became involved in libel suits and other legal controversies for the remaining 18 years of his life. At home again in Cooperstown, Cooper continued his role as a wealthy landlord. Although he became involved in controversies even here with his own townspeople, he took part in community activities. He attended the church which his father had built near Otsego Hall. Cooper told the story of the construction of the church and the choice of denominational affiliation in The Pioneers. The land and materials for the church were donated by William Cooper, but the choice of denomination was left to the people. In the novel, Cooper explains that, under an implied agreement, the question should be fairly put to the people, that they might decide to what denomination it should belong. Again, in The Pioneers, Cooper gives further details. The steeple, he explains, was modeled after one of the smaller of those spires that adorn the great London Cathedral. With this in mind, in the novel, the people named the church the New St. Paul's. Although Cooper's popularity as a citizen of Cooperstown declined during the last years of his life, he was honored in death by being buried in the graveyard adjoining the church which his father had built. Cooper died in Otsego Hall, September 14, 1851. Here in the church cemetery, in the Cooper family plot, he was laid to rest. Large marble tombstones cover the graves of Cooper and his wife. He died in obscurity so far as the literary world was concerned, but 5 months later, a small memorial service was conducted in New York City. At the memorial service, letters were read from Hawthorne, Melville, Emerson, Longfellow, and others. William Cullen Bryant read a memorable and perceptive tribute, Discourse on the Life, genius, and writings of James Fenimore Cooper, and Daniel Webster delivered a brief eulogy. Praise was not lavish in this service, but the modest tribute somehow fits the initial recognition of the author who has become known as the founder of the American novel and, in a sense, of American literature. Continuing recognition is assured not only through the strength of his novels, but by the paintings, manuscripts, and other mementos preserved and displayed in the Fenimore House in Cooperstown. The Fenimore House was built in 1932 on the site of a rural cottage belonging to Cooper. The house is the headquarters of the New York State Historical Association. Cooper has gained a well-deserved prominent position in American literature in both the quantity and the quality of his writings. Not all of his novels are popular today, but a few continue to preserve his reputation. However, Dr. Walker concludes that every Cooper novel contains examples of his literary forte, vivid characterization, an aura of romance diffused through adventure, suspense, or lore, a sense of Native American humor, and well-drawn landscapes and seascapes. For these qualities, Cooper will retain a secure position as a major novelist in American literature.